pleased to be introducing the Science for the People panel. Hopefully my panelists will join me in just a second by making themselves visible and audible. We are waiting for one panelist who's slightly delayed, who will hopefully join us in a few seconds. So the Science for the People panel starts off a day of BSHS investigating geographies. So we start off with a broad umbrella investigations of a panel that seeks to interrogate the shifting ideas of science for the people. And I say this deliberately slowly because today's panel will be investigating from some very different perspectives, but very complementary perspectives, which I hope will illuminate the rest of the day, the notions of science, what science, for what people, why and when. And we will be bringing 4 completely different but complementary perspectives into the topic, which I'll hope will also illuminate some of the discussions that will be going on today. So just before we launch into our discussion, I will briefly introduce how this panel is going to work, and then secondly, who is on our panel, and then we will launch right into the things. How this panel works is we will be doing a round table, but maybe slightly different from the classic round table that you are used to. After my introduction, I will be chairing a discussion between all of our panelists in which I will ask a question for 2 of our panelists to answer. We will progress through that discussion, but all the while I would like you, the audience, to be noting down any questions, because you are the people in our audience, questions that spring to your mind while we were having this discussion. Please drop these into the Q&A tab, which you can find at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen if you're on an iPad. Hover your cursor over the bottom or the top of your screen and you'll see a Q&A tab, into which please drop any questions for me, our panelists, or anything that really springs to your mind that you would like to have answered in this discussion. So I will then progress to chair the discussion between our panelists, and we'll slowly transition to a discussion involving our audience, putting these questions to our panelists, but also bringing in audience perspectives on interrogating this. So let me introduce our panelists. I'll start with myself. I am Franziska Kohlt. I am a Leverhulme Research Fellow at the Department for History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Leeds, where I am working on a Leverhulme funded project, which is called Science for the People, with Professor John Topham, who is one of our panelists, but also Professor for the History of Science, also at the University of Leeds. And our other panelists who are already here are Professor Charlotte Sleigh, who is Associate Professor in Social Studies of Science at University College London. Also from University College London shortly will be joining us Professor James Wilsdon, who is Professor for Research Policy in the STS field at UCL. And finally, we're also joined by Stuart, who is project coordinator at Wikimedia, who will be speaking about various aspects of the work of Wikimedia, but also Wikipedia, which I think is sort of the most poignant point to come in, if not Science for the People. What else is Science for the People, if not Wikipedia? So I think we'll be bringing in really unique perspectives into this discussion today. So we'll be starting off our discussion right now with Science for the People, current and historical perspectives, by interrogating the notion of science and the people. And I would like to ask John actually to kick us off a little bit, because when we speak about Science for the People, we have a cornucopia of terms we like to use for this. We like to use public science, popular science, public engagement with science. We talk about the participatory turn, and there's suddenly all of these words, and somehow we feel we all sort of know what that means. But then as soon as we start pressing the point, it starts crumbling and it's a bit slippery and we don't really know what that means. And even though we like talking about popular science and historical perspectives, the very term of science for the people, popular science, is so contested and so ever shifting throughout histories in ways that are history that is so hard to grasp, that I thought it would be really interesting and informative for us to actually start with a historical perspective, and a bit of illuminating the history of science for the people. And we'll hand this question to James, perhaps, to give, once he arrives, to give us a slightly contemporary echo to this. But John, would you like to kick us off with a notion of science for the people?
Thank you very much indeed, Fran. And indeed, thanks for putting together this very exciting round table. So I'm going to start by placing both the question and actually the roundtable in the context of the project that Fran and I are currently engaged in, this project funded by a Leverhulme Trust major project grant entitled Science for the People. And it's a project that explores the rise in British society of the idea that having scientifically educated citizens is fundamental to national well-being and prosperity. And in particular, it does this by looking at the wonderfully named Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, founded in 1826 with the mission of promoting, and I quote, the publication of elementary works upon all branches of useful knowledge. The SDUK, as we like to call it for short, produced many hundreds of hugely successful publications over the next 20 years, and it was generally considered to have instituted the production of cheap print in Britain and beyond, and particularly of cheap publications about the sciences. Now, its emphasis on science owed much to the Society's moving spirit. The reformist Liberal MP, Whig MP, Henry Brougham, who first suggested this emphasis in an article on the scientific education of the people. But Brougham beautifully illustrates the slipperiness of this vocabulary, coming out with endlessly changing pronouncements over the years about what was scientific, who the people were. So, for instance, in terms of who the people were, he often wrote or behaved as though the people were exclusively the great bulk of Britain's working population, who especially needed cheap publications and scientific education. But the emphasis here was sometimes on the people themselves, this is a quote, being the great agents of their own education. And he was actually adamant that the government and the established church shouldn't be involved. It's all about the people doing it for themselves. Also, Brougham sometimes explicitly included the rich in those who needed scientific education. And as the publications of his society came out, some were even used as university textbooks. So it was clear that the SDUK considered the need for science to be quite general. So that's, the slipperiness of the people. Now the slipperiness of science. Well, we've got notions of science and useful knowledge here, proving, in fact, endlessly slippery. The SDUK began its Library of Useful Knowledge in 1827 with Brougham's own treatise on the objects, advantages, and pleasures of science, which defined science in its most comprehensive sense as knowledge, or, he said, in its ordinary sense, as knowledge reduced to a system. So this is science, knowledge reduced to a system. And then he identified three great classes of science: mathematics, oh yes, okay, natural philosophy, okay, yeah, and intellectual or moral philosophy. Oh, okay. But then he went on and actually was really only interested in the first two, in what he had to say about the advantages of science. And what were the advantages of science? Well, that mapped on to a kind of hierarchy of class. So we're back to who the people are. So workers would find scientific learning would teach them habits of regular labor, and it would make them more skillful. And some might even become discoverers or inventors and improve their industries. But then there were the higher benefits that others could share. The joy of learning, which would actually make more peaceful citizens, as well as making philosophers or scientists. And best of all was that it would bring an appreciation of the divine creator and raise people to higher things. Wow. Okay, so a real cornucopia of uses. So for Brougham then, science answered a significant array of concerns about economic progress, social control, personal and cultural advancement, and it was relevant in varying ways across the social spectrum, and it was addressed through a set of common media. And while the natural sciences were at the heart, the edges of science were significantly indistinct in ways that really challenge our modern perceptions. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's really interesting, because I think that sort of pulls apart some of the things that in popular discourse are often sort of almost opposed, like you brought in science, the church, and useful knowledge. You brought in the word diffusion, which is so interesting for us to interrogate, because I was speaking about different notions of popular science and the sort of diffusion model, the sort of top-down idea that is often sort of now slightly negatively viewed, if not more than slightly negatively viewed. So seeing that James is still struggling to be joining us, I think Charlotte might actually be great to come into this question instead of James, because I'm sure that you've got plenty to say about that.
Yeah, so John, you've opened it up beautifully for us there, because as Fran says, you know, these are highly contested terms. I was in a meeting about planning our science communication masters, and we started with quite an innocent question, like how many words should there be in each essay or something like that, and fell into a real proper intellectual argument, like a proper standoff about how we should treat science communication texts, and specifically whether we should consider that scientific texts construct their audiences, or whether audiences have agency as they deal with text. So in other words, that question about, you know, whether people reading those SD UK publications, do they kind of swallow the kind of the economic and the theological thread with the hook that comes on the end of that in the process of doing that reading, or are they able to engage participatively with those texts, is very much still a living question today. And for me, one of the most interesting things about working at UCL has been teaching science communication to a lot of Chinese students. And that for me is just fascinating in global terms, to think about that massive audience for science and technology, and to think about the stories that are being told in that part of the world. And I'm slowly trying to get my head around that, hampered by a complete absence of Mandarin. So I'm getting this secondhand by kind of slowly you know, pushing on the students. And it's a big challenge. It's a challenge for them as well to kind of extricate themselves and try and see from an external perspective. But in some ways, what I'm seeing there has some parallels with the SD UK. So there's a very strong sense, I think, of not so much perhaps science for the people as technology for the people that I'm beginning to understand. And that is very powerfully conjoined with a sort of Marxist account of the successive industrial revolutions, which are inevitable and which are making China a better place. And this is a good thing. This is a story that you absolutely have to be engaged with to be a good citizen of that country. So understanding technology is and being positively inclined towards its inevitable progress is a really important part of the story. And there is a really important postgraduate module that I'm still trying to get my head around exactly who takes this module, but I think it's a lot of science graduates. And it translates to something like the philosophy of science, and it's Engels. It's Engels writing on technology, And this is seen as a really core way of understanding science and technology together, and that it's all bound up with a kind of a loyal and proper attitude towards national progress. So I found that absolutely eye-opening to begin to understand that, and I'm hoping there's going to be a lot more research on it.
That's great, and I love that you've brought in the complementary perspectives as well, because it's almost as if I've picked my panelists very well. You brought in really interesting notions that are going to segue us beautifully into the next section, because what has come up now, it's not just that we said, what science for what people and for whom and why, and the words diffusion and knowledge and progress have come up, and progress in society by science, but not just through science, whatever that might be. We've also sort of started pulling apart that we are not just talking about science as a thing, but there's different types of science. The useful knowledge, the useful science, that is the science that's going to bring progress to the people, progress to the nation. And we can really see how geographically and historically we've got strong echoes of these narratives across the history of science. We've got the sort of valuable sciences like technology, which can be, brought to fruition by teaching people this is the thing that's going to get society ahead. And through that, we get commercial notions of science. And that brings us to our next point, in which I would like to bring in, again, sort of a historical and the contemporary perspectives on the sort of formats and forms of science that we have started to consider science. I always bring up a slight anecdote at this point from when I was teaching a science communication module, and I asked my students the question, how do you recognize something as science? As a deliberately open question. And I had a terribly overconfident student who said, well, that's really easy. Every good peer-reviewed article in a scientific journal, like in a real scientific journal, that's science. Everything is not. That's not that. And I mean, it's a beautiful notion to start off with, because the peer-reviewed, double-blind peer-reviewed article in a scientific journal is, even that's a very relatively recent thing, not an uncontested thing at all. But the notion that we have specific formats, specific markers that are science, that where John started talking us through, this is where we started producing science for the people. We started doing this in a particular way. We started picking particular topics because we thought they were valuable, because they had value to society in the longer term. So I want to put the question to John and to Stuart about, talk us a little bit through the particular formats that have come to signal sort of good science and the sort of pitfalls that brings. I suggest John starts us off with a historical perspective, and then Stuart comes in with a more contemporary perspective.
Many thanks, Fran. I'm going to leap in again with what the SD UK considered the best format for making science available to the people. And for them, a really critical question was, what was practicable? How, practically speaking, could science be put into as many hands as possible? And at the start of the 1820s, new book prices were so high and getting higher in Britain, the leading publishers had no interest in making them cheaper. Instead, they banded together to keep prices high. Now, Brougham saw that there were a few small-time booksellers who had found a way to make books cheaper by cramming the type onto the page using new technologies like stereotyping and also publishing books in cheap weekly issues. So for Brougham, the best format was unbelievably cheap 6-penny pamphlets published every 2 weeks that he was sure everybody could afford. And this started the Library of Useful Knowledge, and it was intended to build up into a kind of comprehensive view of useful knowledge in 182 treatises, a kind of modular encyclopedia. And they were arranged into 5 divisions. Natural knowledge, he said, this is quotes, natural knowledge, commonly called natural philosophy, but then there was also intellectual philosophy, ethical philosophy, political philosophy, and biggest of all, history, which included history of science, history of art, nations, individuals. That was the biggest one. And these divisions were then divided into separate branches, each of which was to provide an account of both the fundamental principles, the proofs, the illustrations, and then the practical applications, enabling the reader to acquire a thorough knowledge step by step and with references to other works to go on further. The machinery and reputation of Brougham's society meant that these useful knowledge treatises sold in very large numbers for the period, tens of thousands of copies. But the series was front-loaded with treatises on natural philosophy, and there was lots of satirical comment about just how abstruse these were for the bulk of the populace, causing servants to fall asleep and set houses on fire. That was the joke. The series continued to appear made up into 4 volumes of natural philosophy, and then a number of mathematical and historical and geographical and even ultimately political volumes. And then there was a series for farmers on agriculture and livestock. But the society significantly diversified. And this came very much thanks to one of the publishers that the society employed, a commercial publisher, a man called Charles Knight. And perhaps most striking of the things that Charles Knight got them to do was the library of entertaining knowledge, the volumes of which were designed to convey knowledge by making the experience less didactic and more amusing. But you were still supposed to learn, but you were being entertained in the process. The penny magazine, which was not only more amusing, but actually used the miscellaneous format of the magazine to offer a mixture of content so you could read across from one subject to another. And both had a lot more illustrations, much more visually appealing illustrations. So changing vision of what made for good science. The success of these publications was very considerable. The penny magazine sold over 200,000 copies a week, but now they faced accusations of mission creep. They were giving readers something that was more distracting than useful. You might say, well, how were they to win? So this question of the correct relationship between instruction and amusement goes to the heart of what the SDUK was about. And it's one, of course, that continues to be of enduring importance. What are the most effective means of ensuring that knowledge has saliency while providing enough information to allow meaningful engagement? How do you stop folk from falling asleep and setting the house on fire without being without going off topic?
Whoops, being tech support and chair at the same time. John, this is fantastic. Very, very interesting. And we get these notions of bringing the commercial into the sciences. And I love that you brought in the notion of entertaining. And so you have a commercial notion, like you need to sell it. It's sold in really huge numbers. It needs to be entertaining. If it's not entertaining, is it good science? Is it still valuable science? That raises all sorts of really interesting questions, especially in the sort of popular science setting we think of today, where we still often get these notions about, popular science books, educational science books, not real science. If you're a scientist and engaging in this sort of stuff, are you dumbing it down? Is it still real science? If it's entertaining, is it still valuable? We've got all of these notions. And I think one of the places in which this really comes to play is Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is exceedingly successful. You could argue what the SDUK started. One of the things that the SDUK famously did was come up with a penny cyclopedia. It was a sort of popular encyclopedia, which was broken down into chunks and posted out to people. So you could sort of read an encyclopedia in chunks and build up this sort of knowledge reduced into a system. You could somehow build all of these bits off it. Sort of, you can think of it as democratizing knowledge and that being a really, really great thing. But it also brought in a lot of people who edited it. And some people obviously liked that idea and other people really did not like that idea. And I think that's the sort of thing that makes Wikipedia uniquely successful, but hey, James is here, but also uniquely polarizing, I would argue. So I'm going to throw this question at Stuart, because I think that's really relevant for this point, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's it's interesting being someone who effectively works for an encyclopedia to think a lot about the limitations of the encyclopedia. And a lot of what John was saying rang true from SD UK to the sort of challenges Wikipedia faces now. But I think it's useful to look at the history of Wikipedia and how it got started and why the idea of an encyclopedia specifically was chosen. And it kind of goes back to, sort of mid-90s, early noughties, ideas of, how to kind of collect a lot of knowledge that was very accessible on the internet. Jimmy Wales, that is one of the co-founders of Wikipedia, says he was really inspired by the way open source programming knowledge was being shared on the internet, on things like the Emacs manifesto and so forth. This is quite a long time ago. And then eventually he sort of teamed up with him and Larry Sanger to work on a project called Nupedia, which is a precursor to Wikipedia, and which will perhaps be illustrative of why the encyclopedia is a good format, but also why this openness that we mentioned and having lots of contributors and lots of editors, quite specifically, is really important to accumulating, also building a knowledge base. I think it seems like there's this eternal push-pull between quality of work and who's allowed to do it, and then having a workforce to do the work and do the edits anyway. So this openness closed thing. But Nupedia started off and it had quite a rigorous editing and approval and review process that meant things worked really slowly. They wanted experts to contribute. They wanted people ideally with postgraduate qualifications in the subject they were writing about to be making these contributions. As such, it was incredibly slow. And Larry himself said, maybe we should have a wiki. They looked at the first wiki, which was, it was called the Wiki Web, which was about, again, sharing software documentation. And it was like a kind of a fork or a kind of back end to Nupedia, which would move faster. Eventually, it just became obvious that this was a better way to do things. I think Nupedia, after a few years, had 17,000 articles and only 126 have actually been reviewed and approved. I think there were some duplicates in there. Wikipedia got to hundreds of thousands of articles very, very quickly. This is where there's a bit of a split between Larry Sanger and Jimmy Wales's sort of views on how this should be done. There was, again, this idea of kind of quality, quantity, and so forth. But I think we've seen that the kind of Wikipedia methodology has been borne out as Nupedia just didn't really get going. Larry Sanger attempted to set up another project called Citizendium, which is very similar to Wikipedia. Again, same problem. This reviewing process, this sort of slowing things down. And then also, like we talk about these things as ways of communicating science, and that's good, but sometimes it pushes out what we humanities or softer subjects. One of the problems on Citizendium was Larry Sanger didn't think women's studies was like a top level subject. He thought it fitted somewhere else in, I don't know, anthropology or sociology or something like that. And so the slightly more open sort of, and not Wikipedia has its problems there as well, but the slightly more open sort of elements of what can be in this project, very important to its propagation and its success, really. And it all springs from, bizarrely, a very sort of American libertarian point of view, an ideology around who can participate, structures of power and so forth. And it starts off like that, and eventually these structures start to come into play. But yeah, it's a very very interesting question over, like, is an encyclopedia the best format? I think we could argue that Wikipedia has been very strong because of its an encyclopedia mantra, which is often repeated. If you're doing something on Wikipedia which is not encyclopedic, it will be pushed out very quickly. This does sort of fail us in various ways, as it leaves out more speculative questions or personal accounts or primary sources. Often we know we don't allow primary sources on Wikipedia. So it does sometimes limit the types of knowledge that can be represented, but we're at 6.5 million articles in English, and I think 40 or 50 million, around 50 million articles overall, over 317 languages. So I think the structure itself has been quite useful in terms of stopping it turning into a collection of essays and personal accounts and stuff like that. I mean, we can get on to what Wikipedia is not so good at a bit later, I think. but I think its commitment to this kind of encyclopedic knowledge thing has been quite key to its success.
Great. And I just love the correspondences between historical ideas about encyclopedias and the sort of notion of science. I love that John's started off with this idea of knowledge reduced to a system, that as if you can really break down everything in such a way that, everything will be made accessible. But then also both of you speaking about the challenges that brings, and not just in terms of format, but participation and what can be considered science. And then obviously we're coming on to what we'll be discussing in our next question, the politics of science. And John and Stuart set this up perfectly, and as if with perfect timing, James has now also joined us for this question, because I think it is very tempting, and this is why I put the science into as many quotation marks as I possibly could in the introduction, that we like to think in especially popular discussions of science as neutral. And science, so temptingly, we break down everything into facts, beautiful facts, 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 and how could that have any political dimension to it? And yet, when we just had a look at historical perspectives from the 19th century, John was telling us about Henry Brougham, and he was telling us about the Whigs and their involvement in this creation of knowledge for the people. And then we came on to Stuart, and suddenly he casually drops into there, well, really, it's all about some American libertarian notions of knowledge. And here we go, we're suddenly in the thick of it. Is science neutral? Can science be neutral? And that brings us to the next point, in which I would like to put the question to James and to John about this relationship, this slightly fraught relationship, this slightly publicly under-acknowledged relationship, perhaps, which is yet so obvious, between science and the political, and the idea of science as agnostic in the widest possible sense. And I'd ask you to give us a few perspectives, again, sort of from history and contemporary settings, about this. And I wonder, John, do you want to start off, or shall we start off with James?
I'd happily start off. There's a kind of way in which going sort of from the past to the present seems to make some sense, if that's all right.
Iconoclasm.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most striking aspects of the SD UK, this society that did so much to expand the scope of public engagement with contemporary science, was that it struck out in offering a new kind of neutrality regarding religion. So like the new London University, with whom it shared many committee members, the society was a coalition of people of different religious persuasions, including skeptics, for whom the avoidance of religious topics was seen as a basis for collaboration. So they agreed not to publish anything on what they liked to call controversial divinity, or anything interfering with the principles of revealed religion. Now, in fact, as I mentioned, some of the publications, like Brougham's opening treatise, did make reference to God's existence, but by refusing routinely to discuss the sciences in relationship to Christianity, the society was making a significant stand, and it generated an amount of opposition that people in 200 years later would probably find rather surprising. So for its opponents, like the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, the SDUK's secular character was a major threat to Britain's status as a Christian nation. The situation in regard to politics was, if anything, even more controversial, I think. So the Society's committee was very heavily weighted in favour of liberal and reformist politics. There were 20 MPs on the initial committee. And then when the change of government came in 1830, that meant that for much of the 1830s, a large number of committee members were in power, were in government, including at one point half the cabinet. This having been said, even those who were worried about it, like the Mechanics magazine, didn't think it would be too much of a problem, while ever the Society confined itself to treatises on natural knowledge. That would be okay. There wasn't too much scope there for political interference, the Mechanics magazine thought. And the political treatises that were promised didn't materialize until much later. But once the Society's leaders were in political power, and once they were then facing an outbreak of machine breaking, they started issuing works arguing for the benefits of industrialization based on laissez-faire political economy. They were talking about titles like The Rights of Machinery, The Results of Machinery and The Rights of Industry. So here the politics of the science of political economy were completely transparent to radical workers who were very vocal in their opposition. And there were other ways in which the SDUK's science seemed to contemporaries to be political, especially after the turn to entertainment, which came once many of the committee had entered government. So instead of empowering workers, publications like the Penny magazine seemed to use scientific knowledge to pacify and distract workers, as one put it, to stop our mouths with kangaroos. And in the face of what they saw as pap, radicals on more than one occasion set about creating their own society for the diffusion of political and, in one case, moral knowledge. Scientific knowledge of nature was a mere distraction when the political, economic, and ethical principles of the nation were so badly in need of attention. Does that sound familiar? So I should close by also mentioning that on the other side, there were critics of the SDUK, like an anonymous country gentleman, who saw educating workers in the sciences as being in itself political because it empowered workers and would destabilize British society. So for all its claims to the contrary, there was nothing neutral about the SDUK's efforts to offer science to the people.
Thank you, John. And I think that'll resonate with a lot of things that James will have to bring in from the science and policy perspective, because really when I drafted up this panel, and I put our affiliations down there as the School for History and Philosophy of Science, and really I wrote out this abstract, and I was like, well, you could really just discuss all of this in a contemporary setting also, because the sort of politics of science have been so at the forefront of our minds in this age of crisis, as many like to call it now, with the pandemic, with the climate crisis and so on, and the notion of science being political is just so at the forefront of our minds, really. And what you are saying makes it just so poignant that those people driving the idea of science education in a public forum in government are by default not neutral. Those are people with context. Science does not happen in a vacuum in society either. And I think James will be the perfect person to give us a contemporary perspective onto that. So I'm handing over to James now.
Great, thanks, Fran. Sorry again I was stuck in Zoom purgatory for about 20 minutes trying to get in on the So I do apologise. I did catch most of the discussion, but I was in the cheap seats. But yes, science and policy. I think you're right, Fran. One would hope, given the sort of things we've been through as a society in recent years, that attempts to sort of draw some kind of clean or neat separation between the scientific and the political would be now rendered so patently futile as to sort of not be worth attempting. I'm sure there are those that will and do. I mean, my favourite, to use a historian of science as a source, well, my favourite starting point on this is Steve Shapin's lovely book, Never Pure, with that fantastic subtitle. It's my favourite book title of all time, Historical Studies of Science, as if it was produced by people with bodies situated in time, space, culture and society and struggling for credibility and authority, which I think just about sums up the situation. But I mean, to sort of go slightly back, not long in history, but some of you know, I mean, I spent several years, 15 years ago now, as director of science policy at the Royal Society, which is a great place, a great sort of site in which to examine the tensions alluded to in Steve Shapin's title there. And certainly working at the Royal Society, when I came into the Royal Society, having had a prior career in political think tanks, so sort of for me the political nature of what we were doing was sort of didn't really need saying. It was so obvious, but there was a very real and ongoing battle in that institution on this issue, which was fascinating to observe and at times frustrating to sort of live through and try and work through as someone at least notionally tasked with steering the society's policy work. And if I just mention a sort of couple of examples, when I was there in the lead up to the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009, which was obviously a heated period in climate science, climate politics globally, Climate Gate, the UEA emails, Himalaya Gate, the IPCC, there were these sort of succession of crises manufactured or real hitting the institutions of climate science and of course the interface between those and policy, and the Royal Society found itself right at the centre of this in a number of ways, not least because within the ranks of the society there was a sort of split, a schism, which saw, and I mean, something similar happened in a number of learned societies around the world at the time, which saw 40 fellows of the Royal Society issuing a kind of protest, a petition to the council, objecting to what they perceived as the society's wrong-headed stance on climate science and climate policy. And of course, there have been protests of this kind through the history of that institution. I mean, one thinks of the dissensions as an obvious historic example, but these modern dissenters were unusual in their sort of quantity. I mean, there was quite a large, it wasn't common that we got a sort of, protest from that many fellows of the Royal Society into council. It certainly caused quite a bit of consternation. And it was just a fascinating debate to watch because it sort of centered, it began as if it was an argument about accuracy. So they sort of went in on an argument about the sort of the science, but it very quickly defaulted to being an argument about politics and really on two fronts, sort of big politics and small politics. The big politics being the extent to which an institution like the Royal Society should be engaged in any form of advocacy as these dissenters saw it, as opposed to setting out a straightforward account of the science. I mean, again, I'm putting all this in quote marks as if it exists. So there was a big sort of push on that, and secondly, then there was a big push on the sort of micro politics of accountability within the institution. So climate science, climate politics became a proxy site for a kind of internal battle about whose authority, whose expertise counted in that institution, what it meant for the Royal Society to adopt a position on a topic, to issue a statement, a consensus statement. And so this played out. And it was, I mean, absolutely fascinating. Warren Pearce, my former Sheffield colleague, and I have actually written this up, and there's a paper in the mill of being reviewed on this, which after sort of sitting on all of this material for about 13 years, not quite sure whether and how I should use it. But it really is a very, very interesting insight into, I think, the kind of way in which those battles play out. And, we had still, off the back of all of that, attempts. I remember Paul Nurse, when he came in as president, he did a big sort of public lecture thing on the BBC prime time as these things get anyway, and he had this slogan that was at the centre of the talk, which was, first comes, first we do the politics, then we do the science. And this was his sort of whole mantra of how to deal with contested topics. And of course, to those of us, in STS or history of science or sort of politics more generally, that again, that separation, that sort of linearity between the two seems completely wrong-headed, impossible to achieve. But these battles continue. I'll just say two final things. I'll stop. I think the other thing that struck me very forcefully in that role was the contrast between accepting all of those contestations around uses of scientific evidence for policy in areas like climate, the contrast between that mode of working and then the mode when we as a National Academy engaged in what we might call science for policy, using that as a rather simplistic distinction. Policy for science. So when we actually started talking about the way in which the science system itself should be funded, organized, etc. And here, the relationship back to the actual authority and expertise of the fellowship, of the institution itself, was even more tenuous. And you'd have sort of fellows of the Royal Society, regaling you with tales about their grandkids' experience in primary school as the basis for national curriculum reform, which of course struck most of us, and indeed many other fellows, of course, as a somewhat shaky basis on which to arrive at policy decisions for government. But it was a great example of, again, the way in which this interface is not, I think, as vigorously and formally interrogated as it should be in these kinds of institutions. It certainly, that experience certainly sort of set me off on the path that has led me to ending up doing what I do now, which is very focused on that stuff, on meta research, the politics, the sort of hidden politics of how we fund and organize the research system. And as I said at the start, just to tie up, I think things are better in that I don't hear as many sort of shrill, sort of rather scientific accounts of this relationship perhaps as one used to. On the other hand, of course, there's the prominent counterexamples, not least the way in which science was treated, particularly at the start of COVID-19. And of course, we all can recall the whole led by the science mantra that we were, and Fran, you've written about this very well, at the beginning of that, which was again a bizarre reversion back or sort of attempt to reassert some kind of simplistic relationship with these, and of course that broke down very quickly under the force of the reality of what was going on. But it still is baffling to me that it was even in a way allowed to take hold in the first place. I don't quite know what went on. I'm sure it is one of the things being looked at now in the context of the COVID inquiry. But it certainly stands as a reminder that however much we think we're moving forward in the manner of Chapin's title, we still often have to retell ourselves these same stories.
And it's almost as if we're moving on to our science and storytelling part of our discussion. Just for you audiences out there, please do drop your questions for our panel into the Q&A tab, as we'll slowly be moving through the end of our discussions to more open discussion, hoping to bring in as many questions from the audience as possible. And I think this was this so beautifully juxtaposes that these notions of who gets to make the science, who gets to decide the science, keep coming round and round periodically, but also that they're not quite as simplistic as we might imagine them, because I think we moved quite beautifully from and that's what James just reasserted, that these structures always, well, sometimes seem as hidden as they seem obvious to us intuitively. We like to think of science as this neutral thing, but as soon as you raise the question of politics, it's so obviously there, you cannot ignore it. But then as soon as we start talking about the politics and what that actually entails, it comes to these notions of big politics, small politics, as James just put it. We often see corresponding concepts of elite science and high science and notions like that. But it's also quite evident that there's still a lot more work to be done to sort of visibly and formally interrogate these concepts, as James just said. I also like that you brought in the sort of notion of the shrill scientific led by the science things, and this gives me occasion to move us on from the sort of top top-down approaches to the people part of our panel. Science for what people? And as I said at the start, we're sort of prefacing a day of geographic interrogations of science, and especially at this point in time, we're moving on to bringing in and bringing to the foreground notions of marginalized voices in science. And for that, a people-centric approach is absolutely crucial. I would like to hand this question first to Charlotte and then back to Stuart, who are very focused on the people end of things, but also especially with regard to the geography questions, which people and why historically, and why historically not other people. And I know that Charlotte and I have worked on especially the sort of shrill scientific notions of who gets to make the science. So I'd be really pleased to hear more from Charlotte on these notions, and then hand on to Stuart. And please remember to put your questions into the Q&A tab.
James, I'm really excited to read this paper when it comes out. And what I wanted to talk about today, I think follows on from that very naturally, chronologically and thematically. So it's the question of sort of after that, perhaps that sort of final phase of supposedly scientific denial of the climate crisis, what came after that when it became really incontrovertible, and the question arose of what kind of science do we want or need for this moment of crisis? What kind of science is going to be sufficient for this moment? And I've been very interested in a series of books and films that have kind of emerged over the last 10 years or so. So I'm sharing my screen at the moment, and on the screen I've got covers from a number of books that sort of emerged in this cluster. So Peter Wohleben's Hidden Life of Trees, which was an early example from the genre, originally published in German. Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer. Finding the Mother Tree, Suzanne Simard, Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. And then I've got one example of a film, Fantastic Fungi, and an example of a show, Rooted Beings, at the Wellcome Collection, which was on this time last year. And all of these, I think, constructed scientific authority in a really interesting and different kind of way that I think evidently, given the success of this genre, touched a nerve or appealed to something really important in their audiences. A few things that connect these books, films. The choice of organism is not your classic nature documentary type of organism. We could argue that they're queer organisms. That, I guess, would be another talk in its own right. The phenomena under discussion are very much in common between these different outputs. Symbiosis is important. Networks are important. That's really interesting, I think, because there's a connection between what is seen as the content of the science and the mediatization of the science, exactly as there was in the 19th century. Or in parallel to that. So for the SDUK, the steam press was in some ways the acme, or the apotheosis of doing science, right? It was the thing that was made, and it was also the thing that mediatized knowledge about that science, or aimed to kind of enable buy-in into that science. And in the same way, the networks amongst these fungi, I think, connect up with the idea of networks on the web and the wiki ideal. So I think that's a really interesting connection. I'll unshare my screen to talk about epistemology. So there are, I think, different epistemologies of science at play in these books from the classic scientistic model. The scientists are more present as whole people. So Simard gives us a wonderful gendered account of her experience as a scientist. They dispense with Western notions of objectivity, that strict separation between the researching self and the thing that is researched. I recently came across the word transjectivity, which I just am very excited about that word, which is beautifully blurs this sense of the knowing subject as formed by their interactions with others, including the object, and vice versa. It's a word from therapy, actually. Thirdly, I think what these examples do is they value indigenous methodologies, and that's something that's been coming up within STS. And I can't quite figure out, what's cause and effect here. Are these people reading STS and grasping that, or are we reading them, or is it the same theme coming up in different ways? Robin Wall Kimmerer, of course, herself is an Indigenous person, and she foregrounds that in her work. What's interesting to me, what has been interesting to me just over the last month, I've been conducting some interviews for a science communication project about climate change and theology, and I've been interviewing agricultural and theological practitioners in Africa, and finding the same messages about Indigenous knowledge in relation to scientific epistemology coming through from them. And that was great to hear, because those are people who've had the double whammy of imperialism, both from science and from Christianity, but still there's that same sense coming through. So that was really exciting to me, and suggests a different notion of science being wanted and needed in various quarters in this moment of crisis.
And I think from there, it'll be really interesting to bring on Stuart and Wikipedia and its global reach. I love that Charlotte just used this word networks and science as a process of building networks. I was always particularly struck, and it's one of my favorite texts to go back to, is a collaboration by Seton and Latour, when they said the challenges we face as scholars and practitioners of history of science communication, and something he calls media archaeology, is the challenge of building, of weaving attachments. And that's very much this notion of networks and science for the people, as science that is something, as James just so beautifully said, done by people in bodies that live in actual places that have their own networks. And I think this will be great, because Stuart, if you could speak a little bit to Wikipedia and its global reach, and what sort of knowledge should we share, how should we share it, before we move on to our final 2 points. And again, quick reminder for the audience, I can see that you are there. Please give us some questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes I look at the millions of articles, and I think it gets a few 100 million views a month, so reaching a lot of people. But I often think, who are we reaching? Who's reading this? And I was watching a documentary the other day called One of Us, about people trying to leave the Hasidic community in Brooklyn. And there's this one guy who's, I think, 18 or 19, and he's never had a kind of, a liberal education, science, humanities, and so forth. It's all yeshiva, essentially. And he gets on the internet and he's talking about Wikipedia, like it's a new thing, and saying, oh, they explain this. He's like learning all these kind of scientific terms and so forth. And he said it's like a gift from God, which is, it's nice to have that kind of feedback. Sometimes I didn't write it, obviously, but but it's an interesting example of the kind of people that Wikipedia can reach, i.e. anyone with an internet connection. And I think this is increasingly important given climate crisis we're facing. We're well positioned to reach sort of communities on the forefront of some of these issues. So Latin America, so Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers, and so forth. And a fair bit of the work Wikimedia tries to do is get content into outside languages outside of English, and obviously Spanish and Portuguese are very widely spoken, but we're thinking about Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, and so forth, to reach, so people don't have to engage with this knowledge via English, via Spanish, via Turkish, via Chinese, and so forth. So in terms of the audiences, we're trying to reach, it's still sort of difficult. There's still a lot of challenges in kind of getting it into a format that will be useful to them. And I think the encyclopedia has its drawbacks in terms as a communications tool, because it's quite verbose. Sometimes doesn't read very well. I think a lot of things need rewriting and need updating. So it's not necessarily the best tool for communicating with everyone, but sometimes it is. It's not a perfect encyclopedia. It's a good encyclopedia, which is what we like to say. And the fact that we can reach hundreds of millions of people with it perhaps makes up for the fact that it's not so perfect. In terms of the knowledge we have on Wikipedia, well, we have that kind of global North white male degree educated problem, where most of it, say German or English Wikipedia was initially written by white men with a degree, and as such that has privileged certain types of knowledge or certain types of ways of talking about things. I think understanding sort of perhaps indigenous attitudes towards science is not that well represented on Wikipedia. As a result, people have set up other types of projects within the Wikimedia movement. So Wikiscore has been a project for a couple of years which accepts primary sources, which is better at building community knowledge and so forth. And hopefully there will be a bit of a bridge between that and Wikipedia's more formal structure. The other things are things like media, like audio files. Audio files are a nice way of sneaking primary sources onto Wikipedia. If you can have a recording of someone we're talking about an indigenous approach to science on an article, that would be very good, because it doesn't necessarily need to be cited, so it doesn't fall foul of Wikipedia's secondary sources, academic papers kind of rules, but it could be a way of expressing something from a different point of view. But we have problems with this. We have problems with recording knowledge. Recording indigenous knowledge is such a difficult subject as well, and there are a fair few indigenous language projects which don't have open wikis. They're resources for those communities themselves. So there's always this question of whether we should, our kind of philosophy is this kind of Samuel Johnson Diderot approach to a sort of cataloguing the world's knowledge. This is just replicating some of these colonial attitudes that we talked about a little bit earlier, and whether we should be doing this. And I do kind of believe we should, but we obviously have to be careful about the power structures and taking knowledge away from people, or being seen to be taking knowledge away from people. So a bit rambly, but I hope I've communicated at least kind of who we're trying to communicate to and whose knowledge we're trying to communicate. And I think, just as a broader point, the more people that contribute to these projects from a wider and diverse set of backgrounds, the better the knowledge will become. And Wikipedia has become better on a lot of issues over the past 5-10 years because of participation, I think.
Great, and that's obviously a hint to all of our audiences. Do use this platform, because, as I think we so remarkably started off our discussion with the SDUK and its impressive print numbers of 200,000 or so issues back in the days. I think Wikipedia is now dwarfing those numbers by such dimensions that are hard to imagine. We like as science historians to highlight how massive these numbers were then, but that just puts into perspective how massive these numbers that of audiences that Wikipedia can really reach, and are in today's dimensions, and what that should maybe perhaps how that should reframe for us as practitioners, as scholars of history of science communication, of STS, how we can engage with audiences beyond the academic setting through something that is not perfect but good. And that brings us to the sort of final closing questions, which I'll hope we can sort of transition from into the discussion. So here's another hint for our audiences. I can see you're there. Drop us some of your questions to kick off this discussion. But yeah, so sort of moving to our final points, which I would like to sort of focus on the aspect of science and storytelling and the challenges this brings for science in the public, for us as practitioners, as scholars. And I'd like to put this question perhaps first to James, but then also to bring in Charlotte, to bring in Stuart on the sort of challenges of science and storytelling. James, you've already mentioned the sort of science and policy dimension of the sort of what stories do we tell about science? Because I think what this panel has really told us is that these relationship between science and the public are extremely complex. In some ways they have shifted, and in other, and we've seen surprisingly many ways, they haven't actually changed all that much. So I was wondering if you could speak to perhaps like one point around science and storytelling where you think this is really particularly contentious, that really foregrounds just what a huge role the storytelling aspects, the stories we tell about science and the people can be, and what challenges that might bring. And at the challenges point, I'll then bring in everybody else and put a final question to our panel before we move on to the discussion. So James, science and storytelling and its pitfalls.
Thanks, Fran. Well, I mean, I'll pick another kind of relatively recent example, if I may. But I mean, I think one of the most striking shifts, I guess, in one of the stories we tell about science in the political realm in recent times in UK politics, although it's not a new shift nor a new tension, of course, is that move from a focus on the more internationalist sort of universal dimensions of science, the focus on collaboration, to the at least recent spasm of discussion, which has been framed, like I say, at the political level as being all about the UK as a science superpower. And I find that sort of fascinating, if also rather aesthetically distasteful, should we say. I mean, so again, sorry to keep harking on about examples from my time at the RS, but it lends itself to this sort of discussion. But one of the things I was involved when I first got to the Royal Society was this small but reasonably influential publication, which was called New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy, and it was the first attempt in modern times. I say these debates, obviously, as we say in that pamphlet, go back a very long way, but it was an attempt to sort of recast the relationship between the diplomatic and sort of scientific realms in the contemporary sphere, both for governments and for institutions like national academies, drawing on a flurry of debate that had started in the United States around the transition from George W. Bush to Barack Obama's presidency, and the hope and in some ways real turn that signaled towards a more outward-facing international constructive sort of agenda. And so science diplomacy as a sort of term came to the fore in Washington around that time, and we were involved in trying to sort of engender a similar debate in UK policy circles, and it led to the appointment of the first science advisor at the Foreign Office and various other things. And of course, that general approach we then saw running through policy, well, both before that and afterwards. Then, of course, you get to Brexit and all the convulsions that have resulted from that. And in the science policy arena, this very explicit appropriation of science's role in the international sphere in this much more sort of aggressive manner, a rather sort of zero-sum hawkish view of the role of science in international affairs, which has obviously found expression both in this slogan, the science superpower, which was much beloved by Boris Johnson. I think as much for its alliteration as anything else, but also express them more fully in things like the Integrated Review, the big document on foreign security, defence and development policy that came out and was then updated again recently, which devoted an astonishingly large amount of its pages to science technology, but in this very competitive frame. And of course, I mean, as I say, these tensions aren't new. They run all the way through science, and the dance between competition and collaboration has always been there. But it certainly is a sort of shift in the hierarchy of messages, the way in which we've told the story at the political level. And I mean, I don't know where it will go now. Obviously, if we look ahead to change of government, I mean, already it's a bit less sort of bombastic and jingoistic under even the current prime minister than it was under his two immediate predecessors, for in line with broader shifts. But I do think it's really interesting, and will require more sort of sober scholarly reflection in as the sort of heat of some of this dissipates and we have time to take stock of it. I mean, one of the most strikingly obvious things about the phrase science superpower, as has been said by many, is that it's about the least likely phrase to be successful in winning friends and influencing people. If one's goal is actually to be a science superpower, which I say I have my doubts, then the last thing one wants to sort of do is say repeatedly and constantly, we are a science superpower, or we want to be a science superpower, because it's very likely to obviously put people's backs up, as has been the case. And it was very interesting, just to end on this, the public polling that was carried out quite recently by CASE, Campaign for Science Engineering, with its campaign on the sort of decade of investment in science, found actually that even with the broader public, the phrase sort of had absolutely no resonance. It was widely disliked by the British public, as well as I'm sure by those who have encountered it overseas. So that's a story that shifted, and hopefully will shift back to something a bit more balanced and sensible. Just finally on challenges, if you want me to wrap up, Fran, into a last point. I saw Becky Higgett in the list of attendees, so I'm going to mention, if Becky's listening, something that she and I wrote about 10 years ago now, more, which I still think has merit as a challenge and as a sort of possible solution in some of these debates. And I was kind of reminded forcefully of this point when we were going through the worst of that COVID period that we talked about a moment ago, when sort of the led by the science mantra came back to the front. And this was a point that Becky and I made in a Guardian piece, in an edited book that came out in 2012 about science advice in Whitehall, where we argued that alongside the then Foresight programme that was at that point a big feature of the Government Office for Science and the sort of empire of the government chief scientist, there should be the creation of a small, modest, perfectly formed hindsight unit that would sort of scoop in insights from the recent history of science and science policy and sort of feed them in with surgical precision to debates inside government science policy. Of course, this argument went down like a bucket of capsic with Mark Walpert, who was the government chief scientist at the time and was the person to whom the book was directed. So it sort of never got anywhere. But I do think, notwithstanding its long gestation in the policy wilderness, it's an argument that does merit revisiting. I mean, I know that it fits in the broader discussion about history and policy, but I just feel we see in so many contexts and examples that the need for those kinds of perspectives, and I do think for a whole host of reasons I won't have time to go into now, they are often absent from science policy decision making in Whitehall, and I would encourage and give strong support to any efforts to try and structurally bring more of these perspectives into the heart of decision making, particularly at a time when the Government Office of Science has expanded massively, and now, of course, there's an entire department for science, innovation, and technology, at least for the moment. So why not bring back the idea of a hindsight unit, which would give a route in for history of science to the top table of UK science policy? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
think this brings us lovely in a lovely way to the sort of science and the modern Prometheus myths that we like teaching in the literature and science fields, and it's the sort of science and storytelling is just such a strong notion through which to interrogate of what we're doing. Well, seeing that our audiences are being uncharacteristically shy about asking questions, hint hint, I think I am going to use my privilege as a chair to actually come in with one that I nicked from Charlotte, that you asked as a sort of, yeah, I'm cheating here, but I'm totally doing this on purpose. That you asked earlier as a sort of rhetoric question, but I would very much not like to be a rhetoric question. And I encourage our panelists to each, perhaps in turn, perhaps in conversation, reply to this sort of with a view to wrapping up the conversations that we've been having. But Charlotte asked sort of wistfully this question: what kind of science do we want? What do we need and want for this age of crisis? And I would like to expand this question slightly in the light of the discussions that we've been having and the audience that we've got at hand here and the panelists that we've got at hand. What kind of science and what kind of history of science do we need and want for this age of crisis? And I'd like to sort of perhaps go in order, starting with John, going on to Charlotte, going on to Stuart, going on to James, with some responses in order to sort of wrap things up. Our audiences have a final chance to get some questions in here, but in the meantime, yes, coming back with a view to wrapping up, what kind of science, what kind of history of science do we need and want for this age of crisis?
Oh goodness, it's a big one. Okay, a quick stab. It seems to me that one of the main things to take from the kind of foundational moment with the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge is that this attempt to provide science for the people is, profoundly rooted in values. And that what we really need is honesty about values. We need to have an openness to stakeholders. We need to have a dialogue in a way that is absolutely not to be found in the SDUK. And indeed, I mean, I think one thing that you might sort of give the SDUK a little bit more credit for is an openness to other fields of knowledge, a sense that if we're wanting to offer science for the people, then part of that is offering the wider knowledge context in which they can engage. So, political, social, historical, philosophical, and in terms of the humanities more generally. And at a moment when the humanities are clearly in crisis in public discourse, this is a moment to reassert the importance of the humanities for science for the people.
What a lovely way to start us off. It comes really back to these notions of what sort of science was, what was considered science, what was considered superior science, science for the people, but also how that's always gone hand in hand with the marginalization of other perspectives, and not only for the sake of science and education, but often for commercial and other interests. Charlotte, do you want to come in here? Yeah,
I've got a very philosophical answer about teleology, and I'm just going to edit that right out. But I'm talking instead about the paths in the grass, right? So, a few people see something interesting over the other side of a field, and they make a bit of a path in the grass, and you come along and you think, oh, that someone's made a path there. There must be something important there. And then Wikipedia comes along and 1 million people see the path in the grass, and then it becomes a highway, even if the thing has disappeared or perhaps wasn't that worthwhile after all. And I'm thinking very much about the conversation that we had yesterday about teaching history of science, which was very much on the same themes. Do we talk about the things that were important and contextualize them, or do we just strike out on another direction through the grass? And that seems to me a really, really important and difficult question. I love Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia is fantastic. If you've got £10, join the BSHS. If you've got £20, join the BSHS and give £10 to Wikipedia every time it asks you, because it's brilliant. The History of Science article is problematic. It's enormous, and I think it's controlled by quite a small number of people. And a few months ago, Jim Secord and I, as president and VP of the society, had to go at writing a very modest introduction, giving sort of talking about different approaches to the history of science, which was piled on, deleted, and then changed into something about the inevitable tension between science and religion. And it's such a huge article. It's very hard, I think, to unpack for any individual or any, so I'd love to see that maybe opened up, but perhaps that's just repeating the question rather than answering it. But hey, I'm allowed to do that.
But that's just so lovely. Just before I pass this on to Stuart, I think one of the ways in which this conversation started was actually a conversation we were having about science and history of science scholars coming onto Wikipedia, and Stuart saying very firmly, well, if you don't like the Wikipedia article, then come and edit it. And looking at this whole thing and as science and the people, engagement with the people, science is not different from the people, but made by people and by cultures, by people in bodies and places. And the sort of seeing this as a process, as sort of juxtaposed and perhaps contrasted with those tempting scientific notions of science as facts and neutral and so on. That's just in itself so powerful. So I'll hand this on to Stuart as it stands.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. I think we should discuss having another go at the history of science article. In terms of what kind of history of science we should have, or I think one that's openly licensed. Wikipedia relies heavily on sources, and we just reflect kind of what's already out there. So a lot of these perspectives we've talked about today, please articulate, publish them, not necessarily in academic articles, institutional blogs are quite useful places for clarifying things. And we need narratives, and we need things that uncover slightly less well talked about aspects of this subject. I think our history of science, as a Wikipedian, should be, built by everyone. That's sometimes difficult to facilitate who that is, but I think across languages is certainly very important. And, it should be for everyone. So again, going back to the diversities of language, really. But yeah, we just need resources. We need images, we need recordings, we need people to write clarifying blogs, telling stories that challenge great man theories of the history of science and so forth. And yeah, I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Just James.
Sure, I didn't know if you were going to.
Yeah, we do actually now have questions. So thank you to the people who have contributed questions. So I'll let James answer, and then I'll actually try and whiz through those questions we've got before I wrap up this panel. So James, go.
Yeah, I was reading. Oh, we've got 3 questions now. We should, I already touched on some things. From my side, I've always, in my work, although I'm not a historian of science in a formal sense, drawn hugely from the history of science and continue to do so. My love of the field and many of the people who practice it is often their willingness to continue engaging with the most contemporary questions through that lens. And I think that's hugely important and valuable to the wider scientific enterprise and to those sort of adjacent fields around it, like policy and other things that I and others are involved in. A slightly more self-interested plea. I think, as someone who's been drawn as much by accident as design in recent years into this sort of emergent zone of meta research, science of science, all these fields that are in which there's far too much a historical reinvention of the old under spurious banners of the new, which I am always pushing back against. Nonetheless, I do think it would be fantastic to see more visible engagement by history science as a field in some of those debates, because like all areas of our understanding of science and its place in the world, they would be massively enriched by engagement from the history of science community. So and there are some people who do this already, so acknowledging those fully. I think that they're significant, these movements, and although there's a degree of rebranding and rebadging that goes on, they shouldn't be downplayed or missed as opportunities for creative intervention and reinsertion of messages old as well as messages new. So that would be my plea, sort of for history of science to get in there with the meta scientists and the scientists of science and the researchers on research, and make their contribution to those agendas, because they are a chance to, as I say, make old and new points afresh.
Great. I think this ties everything really beautifully together, and seeing that we've got about 3 minutes left of our panel and we will be kicked out at 10:30 whether we want to or not, and there are so many open questions still to address. I think perhaps I'll summarize what's in those questions, of which we have a fourth one just coming in. I think I'll actually, the last one raises a really interesting point, namely that lots of dispute resolution is determined by social capital within an organization, not by expertise or appeal to accuracy. And something that Jim Secord has also dropped into the discussion here, which I think we could have another panel discussion on, is Jim saying, well, how our work as science historians in the public sphere sort of stands against the rise of ChatGPT, which also ties really interesting into this other point, and sort of the generative answers that might come out of this, and how we might want to rethink our role within this. And I think James's point really looms large in that particular point, that especially before the background of science and storytelling, that we are also here to tell these stories, and the more and the wider the platform is that we can use for that, we should really be encouraged by that. Because if and I think that's sort of one of my favorite talking points about science and storytelling, is we are very, very concerned about how we can do this. We can do this well. We have endless ethics procedures and hoops to jump through when we want to do these studies. But in the meantime, this stuff other perspectives, other stories of science will get out there, whether or not they've been edited, whether or not they're good, and there's the topic of misinformation that puts temptingly good stories out there that are, however, not good. So I think that's a huge encouragement for all of us to work together more and work boldly with platforms that we perhaps don't usually consider as academics, because as this panel has so beautifully demonstrated, that has always been the way in science for the people. So I would like to use the final minute to thank everybody, to thank everyone for the questions, even the ones that we haven't been able to answer. And thank you so much for all of these really informative perspectives, and I hope that everybody can take something away from that also for the rest of the day. So, and thanks to the tech team for running everything so smoothly. So round of applause for everybody. Thank you. And I think we'll hand over to Sam to wrap up the session from